The art of wielding your cast-iron skillet well. Uncommon marriage advice from a World War II wife. The room roared with laughter as my 90-year-old grandmother, Naomi, instructed the latest bride-to-be on how she might use the unwrapped skillet gripped in her hand. Every new wife needs a frying pan, she said. And whether you use it to make your man a hearty meal or wield it as a weapon to teach him a lesson, it's up to you. I just want my girls to know they have options. And when the room settled down, she added, "There's a cookbook in there too. Trust me on this. You should use it." Now, only a few of us knew why it was Naomi's personal mission to buy the perfect frying pan and then insist the young brides learn how to use it. She cared about these girls. She knew its power to move one through life and not just a meal. It was her own cast iron skillet that saved her life. The physical strength she had built up over the years making meals eventually gave her the psychological courage to fight off the liquid bravery that stumbled through her back door at night with perfume on his clothing. Perfume. Perfume was a luxury she was rarely afforded, but he wore it like a trophy. Enough was enough, she resolved. The time had come to take back what had been stolen from her in plain sight for the past 25 years, her dignity. Not only had she lost her value as a wife to the shenanigans of her husband throughout their marriage, after the war, she lost her voice to argue against his mischief. You see, public opinion supported all soldiers. Of course they did. Not just those who had placed their lives at risk, but all were given a pass for behaviors of ill repute. This created a new demographic altogether. It's called the blind eye. That's the problem with public opinion, isn't it? It can become responsible for abusive situations such as Naomi's. But by the mid-1960s, public opinion was changing. Many of our young war brides who had once anticipated jubilant marriages had instead been called upon to overlook their husbands' post-war errors of judgment. This was her experience. She wasn't weak, but she did answer the call to turn a blind eye, hopeful that someday things would change. They didn't. But finally, a new age was on the horizon. Women like Naomi began to reconsider their options, and one night in 1967, Naomi resolved to wait up on her husband for the very last time. Instead of making him dinner in her well-seasoned skillet and keeping it warm for him, she would wield it as a weapon, as a warrior princess bride instead. And when he stumbled through the door that night, she would hold it high above her head and challenge him to a long overdue contest of expectations. He laughed at her, complimenting her tenacity, as was his way just before smooth-talking her into forgiving him yet once again. And to his credit, he had been successful using such tactics of compromise since 1941, shortly after their elopement, when his mother had pleaded with her to accept his proposal. "He needs someone strong like you, Naomi," she said, "someone to anchor him." Naomi had naively accepted her plea as a challenge, but little did she know back then what his mother had known all his life. Strength and rules, they never applied to him until now. Though she never told anyone everything that happened that evening with the frying pan, for the first time in 25 years, the realization struck her husband. The rules had indeed changed. She was no longer afraid to pursue a life without him and by the next morning, he had packed up his clothes and left for the very last time. Never again would he embarrass her in front of her family or sweet-talk her into coming back after swindling away their hard-earned money. Never again would he swig back their rent with strange women over an extended weekend, causing them to move one more time or landing their children in one more school. 2 of their children were grown now, and the last one she knew she could raise by herself. He knew it too, and thus began the journey of rebuilding her life as a single mother in the 1960s. A new challenge had been accepted, hers. She got a job working in the deli of the local grocery store. Her frying pan, it had equipped her well, and now it served her as she worked alongside the chef, preparing meals to be sold to the new working class of women, women from both 1 and 2 income homes. Now, domestic abuse, it takes on many forms. It doesn't always have to be physical, and quite often, it's psychological as well as economical. That was Naomi's experience, and for a while, she became powerless. Whatever the type of abuse, according to domesticshelters.org, on average, 1 in every 3 relationships suffer some type of aggression, and demographics still have the power to change those numbers in either direction. Remember the newly created demographic of post-World War II veterans? Turn a blind eye? Well, Naomi, she eventually learned she was not alone. Many of her friends and family members suffered similarly. And though she committed a quarter of a century to accepting the initial challenge presented by her mother-in-law to anchor her son, she also came up with a new outlook that included releasing him back into the wild, thus setting herself free, as did some of her friends and family members. Over time, she began to equip a new generation of young brides with options. Beginning with her children's generation, momentum took hold, and they too learned how to embrace a new set of expectations different from their parents. They learned how to overcome their own societal dictates brought on by the next set of wars and civil rights movements and public opinions. They learned how to make better decisions about a marriage. So let's fast forward to the 1980s and the 1990s, when yet another new generation of children, Naomi's granddaughters, began marrying for the first time, myself included. She became proactive in counseling us before we took our vows with homemade quilts. These quilts were intended to communicate a new perspective of marriage. Wrap one another up in love and in friendship, she would say. It was clever advice and based upon the incredible, successful foundation of her second marriage. But the approach was incomplete. It sounded good, but it lacked staying power. My generation didn't understand the rest of her story or our parents' stories. And we began experiencing staggering rates of divorce, even worse than theirs. It baffled her, and she wanted to know why our marriages were failing when she had worked hard to equip us with good advice. She began to draw us into her home more than ever before. She wanted to study us in an effort to teach us and tell us we had options, not just divorce, but commitment through engagement. Gathering became her mission and her mantra. It was her means of caring for the women in the generations that followed hers. She invited us to tea, to lunch, and even to stay weekends with her. Her place became a safe place. And for a few of us, that was just what we needed. I remember showing up on her doorstep one morning, uninvited, with a toddler right here on my hip. I was in an awful situation and needed a shelter-in-place option immediately. literally and emotionally. My grandmother opened the door and ushered me in as if she had been expecting me all along. We made lunch together and approached the weekend as if it was a well-orchestrated retreat weekend. She didn't push me with questions or expectations. She pampered me with love, acceptance, and respect. Tactics, she told me later, were the keys to helping a person overcome the unique challenges facing them, and even more so for those you suspect might be at risk. It worked. I began sharing from a place of disenchantment, explaining how my marriage was not what I expected. I even dared to mock her advice, saying, wrapping one another up in love and friendship. Sounds good if both parties agree. And that was her clue. I had found my 21-year-old self in a marriage where the rules of marriage applied to just one of us, me. And she had discovered my place of distress was actually coming from a place of aggression at home. She also understood my next steps. We both learned from my experience during that particular season. I knew I was not alone because thankfully popular opinion had changed. It had changed since the 1940s. Acts of abuse were no longer tolerated. They were punishable. I was fortunate in that I had her support to help me through the worst of those times. And over time, we gleaned together. We gleaned that a general lack of understanding about what makes a marriage successful was rampant amongst my generation. We had become a demographic of our own. We'll call it the 1980s children of divorced and single-parent homes who were the 1960s children of divorced and single-parent homes whose parents were the ones that turned the blind eye. Talk about confusion, yet it was clear. But not for long. The second marriages of all three generations, they began to figure it out. They discovered a balance that sticks. Like Naomi's second marriage, which began as a sweet marriage of convenience based on a deep and personal friendship. And then it turned into what she described as a passionate love affair. It was the opposite of her first marriage. And though she carried on with similar responsibilities, she and her frying pan thrived in that second marriage. She wielded that frying pan as a weapon of a different kind, one intent on nourishing her husband and building a community inside their home. He responded with expressions of extreme gratitude, and their marriage was built on a desire for mutual companionship, something they agreed from the beginning should serve them equally. Theirs was a commitment to thrive. So let's return to where this story began. Naomi wasn't telling her great-granddaughters to literally use their frying pans against their spouses, but to psychologically build strength using even the most basic of tools. I remember the way she would raise her good arm and shake her imaginary skillet when the girls had one in their lap. Gather around the table together, she would say, or walk beside one another as friends, or commit to a life of togetherness, just as she and my pappy, her second husband, had done. My grandmother never, ever missed an opportunity to tell her second chance love story, expounding on the benefits of mutual respect and a literal understanding of commitment to one's vows. This, she would say, is how you build a great marriage. And that was how she learned and taught us to celebrate marriage. At her 95th birthday party, there were over 150 members gathered to celebrate her incredible life. And I can confidently report our overall family divorce rates are lower than ever. I credit my grandmother, Naomi, for her ability to face such challenges. She was known to evaluate a situation, be very intentional about overcoming it, and then move on to offer counsel for how to improve the end results for others. The art of wielding her cast iron skillet, building community within the home. It was one of the best lessons and gifts to all the young brides out there. So daughters, may I encourage you to wield your weapons well. Celebrate the gift of companionship.